the shame does immobilize you. It makes you feel powerless, because if I'm inherently wrong, how do I change that? As opposed to if I did something wrong, I can possibly change it, resolve it, fix it, right? So that guilt part, it's empowering as opposed to the shame that's debilitating.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. Or if this is your first time joining in, thank you for being with us. This podcast is a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. I believe that sharing our stories is the first step to healing, and my hope is that the SASS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Pod Vlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week to provide a platform for victims and survivors to tell their story and for experts and professionals to offer insights and information to help us all on our healing path and to provide an education on being trauma-informed in order to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault. If you are a victim, survivor, or know someone who is, or if you investigate or prosecute rape or sexual assault cases, or if you provide treatment, counseling, or interact with victims or survivors of rape or sexual assault in any capacity, I urge you to listen to this podcast. Remember, you are not alone, and we are all here to support you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. This is episode 47. And this week I have the pleasure of presenting the show to you from the platform of the Jan Broberg Foundation's online community, Thrivivors, hosted by Michelle Jackson. This past Monday evening I was the guest presenter on Thrivivors and spoke on the topic of shame. The title of the presentation was The Imposed Shame of Rape and Sexual Assault. What do we do with it? The online audience, who also participated in the open discussion and question and answer portion of the show, were extraordinary contributors to what I feel was a very successful presentation. Jan Broberg and Michelle Jackson were two of the several amazing contributors, but I want to offer my gratitude to every one of the participants for allowing me to air their comments and questions on this show. Austen Tanner, the co-founder of the Jan Broberg Foundation, and Jan Broberg herself have graciously given me permissions to edit and air this episode combining sexual assault survivor stories and Thrivivors. I want to voice my deepest appreciation for their willingness to let me present this special edition of SASS. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed presenting. I'll catch you on the other side. Here's Thrivivors.
Welcome, 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 Thrivivors. Tonight we are joined by an amazing expert, Dave Markel, and I will read a few of the details from his bio. Dave is a seasoned human resources, criminal justice, and Title IX trauma interview investigation professional who, for the last 40 years, has been dedicated to pursuing justice for victims of crime, workplace violence and harassment, and campus interpersonal violence. Dave's commitment to providing ongoing best practices presentations is uncompromising. His career started in 1983 as a patrol officer of the Lafayette Police Department. He was promoted to investigator in 1986, and during his tenure as a detective, he helped establish several programs for training others in law enforcement and coordinated a multidisciplinary response program for sexual assault, child abuse, and domestic violence cases. He retired from the police department in 2001 and began an independent training and consulting business. In January of 2009, Dave was hired by the U.S. Army Criminal Investigations Division, CID, as a highly qualified expert to supervise, manage, and assist in coordinating, producing, and presenting the Army's sexual assault investigation training program based out of the Military Police School in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Dave completed his HQE appointment in 2014 and currently offers trauma-informed interview training through his own business, Markel Consulting, Consulting, LLC. In November 2022, Dave began a weekly podcast, Sexual Assault Survival Stories, also known as SASS. SASS is a platform for victims and survivors of sexual abuse to tell their stories, but also an educational forum for all listeners interested in learning what it means to be trauma-informed and to increase their knowledge and understanding in the neuroscience of trauma and memory. Dave plays a key role for law enforcement, colleagues in universities, medical and social services personnel, advocacy organizations, and HR departments in effective training and consulting in neuro-based communication skills. His presentation content includes promoting and educating others on the practices of this revolutionary effective communication techniques. Welcome, Dave, to Thrivivors. As this is not Dave's first presentation with Thrivivors, I'm sure he feels at home. And Dave, take it away.
Thanks, appreciate that. And just for clarification, that is Lafayette, Colorado, not Lafayette, Louisiana, or any of the other Lafayettes. So yeah, my career was spent in Colorado. I lived there for 22 years and loved it. Now I'm in St. George, Utah, doing sex assault survivor stories, and I'm helping with the Jan Broberg Foundation when and where I can, serving on the board as an advisor and working with you all as an expert. We're going to deviate a little bit from trauma-informed interview principles and talk about shame today. Although I think it's really important that in order to be trauma-informed, which I advocate strongly for everyone to do all they can to become trauma-informed, which is knowing the neuroscience of the brain and what it does in trauma. Also how that impacts the body as well as memory. But it also impacts this psychological aspect. Shame is one of those things. We're just going to talk a little bit about this today. The title of this presentation is actually The Imposed Shame of Rape and Sexual Assault. What do we do with it? First and foremost, I have to throw out some caveats. I'm not a clinical or licensed psychologist. I do and have been studying psychology. In fact, I have a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology, but I'm not here to provide treatment or therapy of any kind. What I am here to do is to provide and present some information for you to do with what you feel is appropriate. My hope is that you'll find this presentation educational and informational, but I realize that it's crucial to approach this topic with respect for survivors' experiences and to prioritize your emotional well-being also. My agenda today is threefold. I want to define some terms so that we all have a common understanding of what we're talking about. And number two is to talk about the impact of impositional shame. And we're going to define some of these terms. And then finally, what do we do with it? Shame it's imposed upon us. And we're going to talk about where that imposition comes from and how it works. The reason I chose this topic is because of the words that I hear victims and survivors say throughout my career. Words mean something in profound and deep ways, and sometimes even victims and survivors have a misunderstanding of what they're dealing with in their own lives. So I think it's important that we name our emotions and our feelings. We have to name what it is that we're dealing with, call things out for what they are, and recognize them. I don't think we can properly address these feelings unless we can talk about them. In order to talk about them, we need to name them. Naming them helps identify those particular feelings on an objective level, and identifying them helps us discuss them, and discussing them helps us to develop coping mechanisms for our emotions, and developing coping mechanisms helps us develop more normalcy in our daily lives. And that's what healing is all about, is developing as much normalcy to our lives as we possibly can. I just mentioned coping mechanisms. I read or heard somewhere once that the more coping mechanisms you have, the more mentally stable you will become. And my goal today is to help us understand what it is we're dealing with shame, and then to help develop some coping mechanisms. But let's first define shame, if we could. Shame, dictionary-wise, and in most clinical settings, is defined as a self-focused emotion. Think about that for a minute, self-focused emotion. It arises when a person believes that they are inherently flawed or unworthy or bad, or that they've done something or didn't do something that they should have done to stop something that was done to them that is, in their perception and their definition, as shameful. It makes them feel flawed, unworthy, or bad. Either way, shame arises from the consciousness of something perceived as dishonorable or improper or even ridiculous, but it's self-imposed from inside. And that self-imposition is what we're going to talk about. How did we develop our own self-imposition of shame? Some of the symptoms that people feel when they're dealing with shame are feelings of humiliation and a desire to hide or withdraw, and a belief that one is fundamentally deficient. And shame is more about the self-perceived identity and being damaged than it is anything else. But a lot of people kind of combine the word shame with guilt. I'm feeling guilt and shame, or he must be feeling a lot of guilt and shame. And so let's define guilt. The nuances are really fine and very paper thin. Guilt is an emotion that arises from a sense of responsibility for a specific action or behavior that is perceived as wrong, unethical, or harmful to someone else. It's centered around a particular behavior or action rather than an entire self. And guilt involves a recognition that one's actions have violated their own moral code or societal standards. So how is that different than shame? Most clinical therapists and psychologists say that difference boils down to focus. And if we're focused on one or the other, it kind of helps define things a little better for us. Shame focuses on the self's overall identity and worthiness, leading individuals to feel inherently flawed or having the flaw imposed upon them. And we're going to get to imposition, as I said. Guilt, on the other hand, focuses on a specific behavior or action, making individuals feel remorseful for their actions. And then two huge differences. Shame tends to freeze us and isolate us, and guilt tends to motivate us and change us. Think about that for a minute. If you feel guilty enough, you will change a behavior so that you don't do something again. Whereas rape and sex assault, that shame is imposed upon us just like the act of the experience. Rape and sexual assault were imposed upon us. We didn't ask for it. We didn't do anything wrong. It was imposed upon us by a perpetrator, by someone who took advantage of us in ways that we didn't want them to. But then shame comes in. So it's important to note that shame and guilt are part of the same spectrum of emotion. So on that shame-guilt spectrum, that needle teeters between the two. And sometimes we call it shame and sometimes we call it guilt. But I think it's important for us when we're talking about emotions and naming them to actually name where that shame is and what it is and why it's different than guilt. While excessive shame can be detrimental to mental health and well-being, moderate guilt can serve as a moral compass and drive individuals to improve their behavior. In the therapeutic context and realm, addressing and understanding these emotions differently can be crucial for personal growth and healing. And I think that's one of the aspects I wanted to emphasize for all of us, is to make that differentiation in our own mind. So before I go on, because that nuance is so tricky, I just want to see if there's anybody who wants to turn on your microphone and ask a question about that.
So when you said shame, it isolates, and what was the other word that's
shame tends to freeze us and isolate us. What a great book that I just read. Britt Frank is the author, and it's The Science of Stuck. And we can get stuck because of shame. Kind of just feels like we're frozen because I can't do anything because I feel so shameful. It's a common aspect and denominator of shame. Guilt doesn't tend to do that as much as shame does.
I just thought that was interesting when you said it. Oh, the freeze, the flight, fear, those things, and that shame does the same thing. It freezes us because most of us who experience sexual assault are frozen. That's the most common thing that most of us talk about.
Right. Well, that's a different aspect of the brain that I'm talking about, but it kind of has a correlation. You're right, in the sense that because of the way we're programmed, it can cause us to freeze in a situation. Not everything that we experience that's traumatic makes us freeze. And freezing is just the initial aspect of the trauma response. Freezing can be gotten past if we don't go into tonic immobility. But when it comes to the post-experiential trauma or the post-trauma experience, that shame can have that same kind of freezing aspect on us where we're just stuck. We can't seem to move forward.
Dave, Teresa has a question.
I know you mentioned shame is more of an emotion. Could there be self-imposed guilt?
Both of these can be self-imposed. A lot of people, though, recognize guilt as being something that comes from the outside. There's a law or a moral compass or something along those lines that we've broken, and we feel guilty for that. shame from sexual assault or rape doesn't originate from anything that we did to ourselves incorrectly. That's imposed upon us. But what we feel is, I feel shameful that I didn't stop it. I feel shameful that I didn't do something more that could have prevented this. Or I feel shameful that I was drinking too much. Or I feel shameful that I dressed in a certain way. Or that I was flirting in a certain way. So I must have brought this on to myself. That's where the shame comes in. And that's why you can feel guilty about those things too. That's why the nuance is so paper thin. But the difference I want to emphasize is that shame generally is self-imposed from the aspect of, I didn't do something I should have done, or I did something I shouldn't have done. Guilt is violating a law or social standards that have been put up by a community, things along those lines.
So Dave, as you just highlighted that brings up a question for me. Hypothetically speaking, a child is sexually abused by a parent. Society generally tells us, from a parental standpoint and or a child, you protect the child, you protect the parent. Which one is it if the child discloses what the parent has done to them and the parent is held accountable and responsible? For example, the parent is in prison because of it. Is that now guilt or is it shame? Because you're kind of going against societal norms by telling on your parent.
I think because the nuance is so paper thin and so relative in both aspects, we're talking about that same spectrum of emotion, that I think both play a part. And I do in sex assault and rape too, in ourselves with regard to shame. I think what's harder to overcome and what freezes us is shame more than guilt. And so guilt can generally be resolved. It's not wrong to tell on your parent. So a lot of what they feel then isn't necessarily guilt, but shame. Like, I have harmed myself by harming my parents. Now I'm looked at societally as someone who did something I shouldn't have done to my parent. So I should feel ashamed of that. I think when we get more into the source of that imposition, it might help put more definition on what it is that I'm talking about. I think what is important to realize, though, is that most victims of rape and sexual assault have this internal sense of shame that society imposes on them, which is why I entitled this The Imposed Shame of Rape and Sexual Assault. There's an imposition. Somebody did something to us. So we're going to define imposed. And I think that's probably a good place to go next. It's equally important to understand that what victims and survivors of sexual assault and rape feel is shame that's imposed into or onto an individual who's been raped or sexually assaulted. And that act of having something imposed upon us is the feeling that something is unwelcome or unfamiliar. The act of imposition is usually defined and accompanied by a sense of force or taking on a required or requisite thought process or position. We don't accept it readily. We don't welcome shame. It's forced upon us by our society, by standards that we didn't ourselves have anything to do with. That force or taking on a requisite or required thought process or position is the imposition. Where does the imposition originate? Why does that happen in the first place? Where does it come from? And why is it so powerful and so consuming? Well, some of the places that shame initiates and emanates from is societal norms. We've discussed that. Religious beliefs. And I can't think of one religious sect or organization that doesn't attach some sort of shame to sexual impropriety. But the source of that sexual impropriety is where the confusion comes in with victims. And they are adopting or feeling a sense of requisite feeling. I must feel shamed because that's what society and my religion and my upbringing and my parents and media portrayals, all of those outside forces are telling me I should feel. It's adopted in our mindset when we're really young. We don't understand it necessarily, but we feel it. We feel that shame. I can remember feeling shame clear back as early as 3 and 4 years old. And if we stop and think about some of those processes of what shame is, then I think we can all recognize that we felt shame at a very young age, that it's not because of something that we're born with, it's something that's taught to us. It's an outside impositional force. All of these contribute to feelings of shame around sexual assault and rape, and they're external factors that can and do shape individuals' perceptions of what is normal and acceptable. I know Scarlett is part of this tonight. She and I were talking earlier today, and she said something about shame that really struck me. And I thought, man, I'm going to impart that to this audience. She says, shame has been weaponized. And it's been weaponized by two sources in my estimation of what she said by that. And that is the perpetrator, who tries to make us feel even more shame by making us feel like it's your fault. You did this. If you hadn't been so drunk, if you hadn't been so sexy, if you hadn't been dressed that way, if you hadn't said those things, I wouldn't have done what I did. So that blame comes from the perpetrator. So does the shame. And then society is the other source. Cultural responses to rape vary widely around the world, and some of these responses may be perceived as extreme and inappropriate from a human rights or social justice perspective. And it's important to note that cultural norms and values can influence how societies address issues like rape, and what might be considered inappropriate or extreme in one culture might be viewed differently in the other. And I'm going to give some examples of that real quick. Victim blaming. Where does that come from? That comes from perpetrator mentality. I didn't do this, the victim did. And who's adopted that? Probably more than anyone else? Law enforcement. What did you do to ask for this? Why are you staying in this domestic violence situation? And domestic violence, by the way, usually does, and I would say almost always does, entail rape and sexual assault also. It's an impositional thing that perpetrators in society pushes onto the victim. Victim blaming is a huge one. What I want you to do as I go through these is think about which ones are viable for the culture that we live in and which ones aren't. Because I'm going to talk about some that aren't necessarily part of our society. For instance, the next one, forced marriage to the perpetrator. Believe it or not, in some societies that still occurs. Survivors of rape may be pressured or forced to marry their rapists. The practice is rooted in the belief that marriage can restore the survivor's honor and reputation. I don't understand where anybody would come up with the concept that to restore the virtue or honor of a rape victim would be to marry the rapist. Is mind-boggling to me. However, it's a response that can further victimize the survivor and prevent them from accessing justice. Another one is honor killings. You've probably heard about this, and I know this is hard to talk about. In some cultures, we have to acknowledge the fact that there have been victims, especially women, who are subjected to honor killings. And they're carried out by family members in an attempt to restore the family's honor that is perceived to be tarnished by the rape. And part of that, I think, comes from a male-dominated society. And some of that, I think, comes from the idea, again, victim blaming. Well, if you hadn't done this, he wouldn't have done that. And I'm using those pronouns for a reason. I understand that they can be turned to any different sexual identity. It's horrific. And all of these are, to some degree or another. The next one is stigmatization and social isolation, where rape survivors in certain cultures may be stigmatized and socially isolated due to the belief that they're impure or tainted. And this can lead to survivors being abandoned by their families and communities, and it compounds the trauma they've already experienced. When I said at the beginning, think about these and which ones apply. So far, the first one and this one, I think, are super strong aspects of the shame that exists in our society here in the United States and most countries, that stigmatization and social isolation and victim blaming are probably at the top of the list. But there's also the next one, the inadequate legal responses. Some countries, some states in this country might have laws or legal practices that fail to adequately address rape and sexual violence, and this can include lenient sentences for perpetrators. We see it all the time. Or laws that require a high burden of proof, making it difficult, if not impossible, for survivors to seek justice. I think one of the important aspects of why I wanted to do this is to bring this stuff to light, because I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but if we don't talk about it among ourselves, we're not going to talk about it to other people. And I think that's what's important. It's why Jan started her podcast. It's why I started my podcast. It's why this online community exists, is so that we can sit here and discuss these things and become educated and name them and do something about it, because we all have a role in bringing justice to victims of rape and sexual assault, even those of us who have been victimized. Then there's lack of support services. There might be lack of comprehensive support services to rape survivors, including medical care, counseling, and legal assistance. And that lack of support can hinder survivors from healing and seeking justice. What does that do? Causes more shame. Like, I must be doing something wrong. I don't deserve that. Therefore, I'm not getting it. If I deserved it, it would be offered to me. And so that shame is compounded. And then denial of marital rape. This is another biggie here in this country. In some cultures, the concept of marital rape is not recognized or addressed within the legal framework. The assumption is that consent is implied within marriage. This denies survivors the protection and justice they deserve. And I know from being in law enforcement that there were some states that it was legal to rape your wife, or vice versa, a wife to rape her husband. There was no law against it. The laws were very clear that that was not illegal. And I think it is illegal in all 50 states now, but is it enforced? Absolutely not. I see it day in and day out where it's just law enforcement turning a blind eye to rape in marital situations. So what's the impact? Well, the impact is daunting, to say the least, on our self-esteem. And when I talk about our self-esteem and being daunting, what I'm saying is it's always a negative impact. It lowers our self-esteem and our self-worth because we internalize those negative feelings that can attack and devour our once strong selves. That's where I think the difference between guilt and shame comes in. It's how we internalize it and what we do with it and how it eats away at us. Secondly, it can and usually does lead us to isolate. We isolate socially. We isolate from our communities, but we also isolate in our work lives and in our interpersonal relationships. And why do we isolate? Well, psychologically, it's all an attempt to hide what we're perceiving internally as our own personal flaws that caused us to be raped or sexually assaulted in the first place. I brought this on myself. I don't want anybody to see how messed up I am because of how I brought this on myself. Therefore, I'm just going to close myself off from people. Thirdly is the severe damage that can result from prolonged or intense shame that in turn contributes to mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, fear of almost everything. I'm not talking about just fear of being raped or sexually assaulted again. I know that there are victims and survivors who fear going out in public, who fear taking a shower, who fear being alone at night without a protector, who fear having a protector around because they think that protector might turn on them, who fear darkness, who fear you name it. That's what shame does to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Yeah, it's all bad and it's all debilitating. So what do we do? And that's the third question. And that's what I wanted to talk to you mostly about is what do we do about that imposed shame? Well, there's some really strong research called Self-Compassion and Shame Among Rape Survivors. And I'll be glad to provide this to Jan or Austen so that they can actually post the names of the authors of the two research doctors that did this. And it talks about one of the most important aspects that has been found research-wise to dealing with shame is self-compassion. Practicing self-compassion not only reduces shame, but also fosters improved emotional regulation and decreased experiential avoidance. So I just talked about how we avoid things. Self-compassion decreases that avoidance. First, we need to understand what self-compassion is and that shame and self-compassion are negatively associated with each other. So it's like the exact opposites. If you're feeling shame, you can't feel self-compassion. So we have to bring in the self-compassion to get rid of the shame. How do we practice self-compassion? One important way is through mindfulness. And we talked about naming our emotions and feelings. Mindfulness does that. Mindfulness takes us to places where we energize our minds to take inventory of our physical and emotional bodies and where we are carrying our shame. Believe it or not, you could be carrying your shame in your stomach and have stomach issues. You could be carrying your shame in your shoulders and be hunched over and sore all the time. Some people carry their shame in their head and have constant headaches. It happens everywhere in our bodies, including our feet and our legs and our torsos. You can carry shame in multiple places too. It doesn't have to be isolated in one part of the body. So pay attention to what we're telling ourselves about our own shame and where we're putting it, and then counter that with what I call compassionate reason. Because self-talk therapy is powerful. I remember when I started first hearing about self-talk therapy, and it was clear back in the early to mid 70s. And one of the really neat things about it is that it works because our minds have what scientists call plasticity. And we can actually, through our thought processes and talking to ourselves, change our own neural paths. It's a powerful but also free way of providing therapy for yourself. Another way is to exercise, even if it's just for 2 minutes a day. Some of us are so physically constrained by our shame and in our bodies and other physical illnesses and ailments that it's really hard to exercise. I recognize that. I'm not being flippant about this when I say just exercise. I'm not saying just exercise. I'm saying do what you can to try and exercise. The latest research I heard again was that a minute a month of exercise is helpful. I even said, let's try for a minute or 2 minutes a day. If you can just set aside some time to move your body differently in a rhythmic way, or lift something, even if it's a book over your head, or sitting in a chair and standing up, and then sitting down and then standing up. Just some sort of exercise, because again, going back to research shows that exercise helps your brain function more clearly and better, and your memory even improves. So self-compassion, self-talk, exercise, get therapy if at all possible. Some people can't afford it, but if it's available to you, get it. Or if there's some source of free therapy, I strongly encourage therapy. I think everybody should be in therapy, period, regardless of your background and experiences. But especially if shame is affecting your daily performance in largely negative ways, I would encourage you to do what you can to reach out and try and get some therapy. And then my personal favorite for self-compassion is practicing gratitude. Take a very serious inventory of all that you have to be grateful for, and think on those things and push the shame out. If you think on the things that are in our lives that we have to be grateful for, even if it's just our next breath, and we dwell on that deeply, and we meditate and concentrate on what is good in our lives, even if it doesn't feel like there is very much good, but if you focus on that, again, the deal with shame is where we put our focus. And if you put your focus on that which we have to be grateful for, it helps the plasticity of our brains, and it changes, trust me, it's true, gratitude changes neural paths. It's been scientifically proven to be mind-altering in very, very positive ways. That's my discussion on the imposed shame, rape and sexual assault, and what we should do about it. And I hope it's been helpful for you.
Thank you so much, Dave, for that. Yes, we do have time left. Are there any questions? Kathy?
Hey, Kathy.
Yeah, first of all, when I saw that you were going to be speaking again, I was like, yay. I don't know what it is about you, but I think you were the first speaker that I ever saw from Thrivivors. And it was amazing to have, just the things you said to me were so validating and so enlightening. So I look forward every time I know that you're going to be involved in something.
Thanks,
But
Kathy.
I notice that I have suffered with both of those things, the shame and the guilt, throughout the years. And I think I've done a really good job of overcoming a lot of that myself through therapy, reading books, different things. But I don't know, does it ever go away? It shows up in different areas. If something goes wrong, then it just automatically comes back that it's my fault and I did something to cause that wrong.
Yeah, that shame has indwelled in your thought processes and mind configuration for so long that when you feel like you're getting past that shame, if something activates it, boom, it just comes flooding back because your brain is so used to that. But all the research I'm reading says yes, that shame can be completely pushed out of the brain to the point where it is no longer in existence for whatever particular origin point that shame moved in. And again, it has a lot to do with self-compassion, all those things that I talked about, because you are literally trying to rewire your brain. Your neural paths have just dug these deep, think of a big wagon wheel rut in the mud, and it dries and the rain comes again, and it's going to go right there, right where that rut is first. So what we're trying to do is erase those ruts and build new pathways that lead to not being stuck in the mud, but moving into compassion for ourselves and thought processes that say, I'm not going to let shame have control over my thought processes and who I am. I'm going to dissolve that and put into action some things that eliminate the perpetrator and society from having power over me. Yes, it can happen. It takes time, but it can happen. And I'm really thankful for you and that question. Hope nothing but the best for you in continuing your efforts to heal that way.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Hi, It really is such an important conversation because my ex-mother-in-law, she'd call the devil Scratch. She said, "Oh, is Scratch on your shoulder today? Oh, just Scratch. Oh, just flip him off," whatever. So she kind of had this kind of identity, so that, if you did something bad, it wasn't you, it was Scratch. And I don't know why, for some reason, when I was dealing with a lot of that shame thing in my life, I was like, if I could not have shame be in my identity, but be a separate identity that just comes in and sits on my shoulder, and I just go, "What are you doing here? No, you're not welcome here." Like, go away. Almost like some way to actually like put it into almost a physical form that was outside of my body. I always feel like shame is a thing that is like, this is what I am. I'm bad. I'm dumb. I'm stupid. I didn't do the right thing. I continually make all these same stupid mistakes. I trust people too easily. Blah, 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 blah. It just goes on and on. That's how it feels. And so when I was really practicing this, that's what came to mind, was call that something and, flip it off, basically. Flip it off with your middle finger, flip it off. And just that you're not welcome here. So I could literally catch it when it was happening. And I was thinking and feeling that way and go, no, I'd rather go to sleep. I'd rather go read a book. I'd rather watch something on TV than talk to you. And it really became like this thing that was outside of my body. And gratitude also was a huge part. Really, truly, finally, shame went away. It was replaced by that little gratitude journal that I did, and that I did it so faithfully over a period of time. And it really made a huge impact on that, because all of a sudden I was like, I can see good in pretty much any day, even the worst day, even the worst of days. So I don't know, those are just two things that kind of, for sure, I know that the gratitude thing, where I was really focused on that for a couple of years, every day had to be something different. I know it repatterned my shame brain.
It does. Yeah, you're spot on. And like I said, it's one of my personal favorites. I think it's one of the personal favorites of Oprah Winfrey too. She talks about how important gratitude was in her life, and she grew up with tons of shame also. But yes, Jan and Kathy, to go back to what you were saying, it is something that you can get past. I know Scarlett, when I was talking to her this morning, said that I'm not going to feel shame because that feels to me like it's giving victory to my perpetrator. And I'm not going to give victory to my perpetrator in any way, shape, or form. And those kind of thought processes, that right there, and what you were saying, Jan, are so important to rewiring the brain and saying, no, I don't have to feel shame. I have nothing to be shameful of in regard to all of this, or pretty much anything in our lives. If we think about it, shame is imposed, and we've got to find the source of the imposition and get rid of that imposition. And imposition is just what it says it is, an imposition. It's like your neighbor coming over at 10 o'clock at night saying, "Hey, I brought a casserole and we're going to play cards all night." No, we're not. I'm going to bed. Teresa, did you have a question?
I really liked what you said about shame being used as a weapon. That really struck me somehow, and I'm still processing that right now.
Mm-hmm.
But then I always do the self-talk, and I always have to tell myself, I treat shame as a visitor, not as a resident in myself, in my brain. And I just go, you know what? It's a visitor. I could always tell my visitor to leave, just like what you just said. No, we're not having casserole at 10:30 at night. I'm going to sleep. You could leave now because I'm going to go to sleep. And it's okay for me not to entertain that visitor. And it's a visitor that I just don't want. I trained myself to actually just physically see shame as like a visitor that I really don't want to see, or anger or guilt or whatever it is. I'm still processing what Scarlett said about how self-imposed shame is, or just shame in general, is just used as a weapon. And I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah.
If I ever process that soon.
Well, when Scarlett used those words, like I said, knowing that I was going to be presenting this afternoon, I just kind of clung to that phrase. And she's like, I am not going to let shame be weaponized against me. And so I have to credit Scarlett for that phrase and me using it. Like I said, excited to hear more from Scarlett when we do our podcast interview next week. It's going to be great. And I hope you all tune in. Her name is Scarlett Robertson. So I hope she's still listening in. She's pretty amazing.
So Dave, next up we have AJ, and then following AJ, Scarlett has raised her hand.
I have a question when you talk about the neural pathways, which fascinates me. I have a traumatic brain injury. So when it comes to shame, I may be slower to recognize that that's what that feeling is. in rerouting your neural pathways, it seems like it happens at a slower rate for me that I can figure out sometimes.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon. In fact, if I'm remembering correctly, I'm probably going to be corrected by some listener somewhere who writes this to me, but I think the whole idea of neuroplasticity came from the early neuroscientists looking at the brain to heal itself from traumatic brain injury, physical injury of the brain, and finding out that it actually could, and then eventually realizing not only physically, but those neural paths emotionally can be healed too. And absolutely, it makes sense that they would be slower for you if you're suffering from TBI. But I love just hearing in your voice some of that attitude, that doesn't sound like you're going to give up. And I think that's commendable. No, that's great.
No, I mean, the fact that I'm here and talking and, I'm alive is, my miracle in itself. But
yeah, a lot of gratitude there.
Oh, totally. Yes.
Yeah.
I've got my several gratitude journals. They keep on getting filled up.
Great.
Maybe
I love
get a
that.
bigger notebook. I don't know.
I love hearing that. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
Scarlett, you're up next.
Hiya, hi.
Oh, there you are.
Here I am. Hi. I'm in bed in the dark, so that's why my screen's off. I haven't really got a question. I just wanted to say that I am so glad that I did stay up past my bedtime tonight to come onto this little meeting, because it has just solidified that I've made the best choice on who to share my story with so publicly. And everything you have said, even things that aren't directly connected to my story, have just been so, yeah, damn straight, damn right, and it's just wonderful to be in a group of people who are just totally there on the same level, and yet on so many different levels. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
I think we feel gratitude for you being here and for you having the courage and the voice to say what you just said. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for staying up. It's awesome.
Yes.
I am really looking forward to our episode. I really am.
Me too. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
My comment is a great big thank you, not only to all of you for being part of this forum this afternoon with Thrivivors, but also a great big huge thank you. I haven't talked to Jan in probably a couple of months, and it's good to see you again. And I really appreciate you being part of my life and letting me be part of yours and this organization.
Thank you, Dave. I feel like Kathy, anybody that's heard you before, it's something to look forward to. You have a kindness and a way of speaking about things that just helps us all register like, oh, I could do this in order to overcome that. And I just want to make sure that from my comment, I also have been able to a great degree, understand when what I'm feeling or what I'm thinking is something that is of guilt because I feel bad about something. I want to hurry and make it right, say I'm sorry, whatever it is. And that, I think, is why those two things are so different. Like when you explained that, Dave, that shame is like I am this, and guilt is like, oh, I did something. I did something that I feel morally was wrong, or I had a meltdown in traffic or at home, or and I know it's wrong. I know that I didn't have control over my emotions and I hurt somebody's feelings, or I swore at somebody. I flipped somebody off the other day and I'm like, you're just really an awesome person, Jan Broberg. And I'm like, gotta figure out how to calm the heck down, who knows what's going on with that person? You cannot take this personally when you're in traffic, because there have been a couple of shootings in Utah that have been on the news in the last little while from road rage, and one person died. And I'm just like, you gotta get into that zone of peace in the power of now. We're not going to do that. But I can understand the difference between shame and when I feel guilty about doing something and I can try to make that right, and that's the good thing. It does motivate. That's why I love those first couple of words that you used. And just to reiterate that shame is that thing that freezes you, that shuts you down and freezes you. And guilt can be something that will motivate you to change something or to do something to make something right. I really like that.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. And thank you, Michelle, for moderating all this.
Kathy raised her hand.
I just wanted to say one thing I have found that has helped me with, I guess, the shame is that I talk about it. I mean, not the shame, but I talk about the abuse. If I'm talking to my daughter and something comes up about the kids, and I'm like, well, I know it happens, so I'm going to talk to you. I talk about it around my grandkids. I don't give details, obviously, but this is something that can happen. So we all need to be observant and paying attention and talking and being open about things. The only people I can feel like gasps from when I say anything are people from my family, people who were around when it was happening.
Mm-hmm.
I find that by just putting it out there and letting it be known, and I was 3 or 4 years old and he was my grandfather, and it is what it is,
I'm so glad you said that, Kathy, because it echoes what I've been saying since I started my podcast and what I said even before that. And that is the best way to deal with sexual assault and rape in our society is to talk about it. And so I'm glad you're doing that. I think that's, again, what the Jan Broberg Foundation is built on. It's why she told her story. It's why she talked to that first group of women about what happened to her, and it's been snowballing ever since. It's why the documentary exists. Yeah, it's why she's a national treasure.
Oh, please, national treasure. But here's the really cool, interesting thing, because I was thinking the same thing, Kathy, about and with Michelle and its family. That is such a strong force of shame. If it happened in the family, people are just like, no way are we ever going to talk about it, because we're going to be looked at like, like there's something wrong with us. Like, because this happened to this poor child, we're just never going to face it. We're never going to talk about it. We don't talk about things like that. We talked about the perpetrator who weaponizes shame. And almost always the perpetrator is in somebody's family to a family member, almost always, which is the thing that nobody wants to look at or see or talk about because it's so awful and terrible. And that's why the gasps are there. And that's why, Michelle can't say anything without her, people go nuts. That is where I think the majority of shame comes from, because it was in the family and the family reacts in such an inappropriate way towards that victim, that survivor, that little person or teenage person or young adult or whatever. It never changes, even if you don't talk about it until you're in your 30s. The same reaction is that even if you tried to say something when you were a kid and you were 14 and you tried to tell your school counselor, it's like that reaction, either you're lying and you'll go to jail, or we don't tell on grandpa because he's grandpa. This is our family and we're going to keep this in our family. We're not going to anybody out there because this is such a terrible, shameful thing. Instead of it's like about the kid, about the person who suffered through this horrible abuse. And I just think that is one of the strongest reasons why shame continues to be this thing that surrounds the child or the young person, the person who was assaulted, because the family will not allow that to be a reality in our family. We're going to close down. We're going to shut all the doors and just keep it in here. And you can't heal. You can't heal yourself or a family. You have to get out of that in order to realize that, I don't hold this burden of shame. This wasn't me as a kid. It's really strong. And that's just something I wanted to point out, that weaponization that is either the perpetrator or society, and it's stigmatized, and we get isolation, social isolation, and shunned. It's almost always the family that's doing that to us. For most of you, that's how it feels to me anyway.
I just want to tell you, my mom has told me many, many, many times he was drunk. He didn't even remember what was happening. It was like, so it's just constantly excusing the behavior rather than keeping me away from him.
Yeah, acknowledging.
Okay, Scarlett.
Thank you. Sorry. People don't like to be uncomfortable. And so and this is a very uncomfortable subject, and the victim is made to be like, please don't be a burden on your family. This is already really hard. So if you could just shut up and put up, that would be so great. Be a good girl, be a good child, and, shut up, sort of thing. We need to make the uncomfortable comfortable, because that's the only way forward. And that is the only way that people will listen. When you make it so normalized that this is talked about, just like you would talk about a robbery that happened down at the local whatever fish and chip shop here, I guess. Anyway, so that's the thing. Make the uncomfortable comfortable, so that it can be talked about and sorted for the right person. And Kathy, like what you were saying about the mother, you and me are just going to get on really well. I think you're going to like my podcast. I think we're going to relate on a lot of things, and that's me.
That is so true. And I'll say it again. It's why I give a platform to people so that they can tell their story. I want people to listen to this online community, not just for ourselves, but so that they can share it with other people and talk about it more and start normalizing the conversation. Absolutely. Thanks, Scarlett. That's perfectly said.
AJ, you're up next.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, my very first break in that shame cycle was sharing my story. And it was doing it on Thrivivors and my safety of this community. Then I shared my story somewhere else, and that didn't turn out very well. That was loads of horrible comments pooped on me. Instead of taking those in, it has more emboldened me to talk more. That I want to talk more. I want to share my story more. I want to keep on talking. Yeah, I wrote those paragraphs for Jan to read on TikTok or wherever you're going to do it, in shortening little pieces or whatever, to write those out, because I want to keep on talking. I can't seem to shut myself up, which is a big change, because when I was younger and I tried to talk the first time, I was the 14-year-old who told the school counselor and was silenced and told, you're going to jail because you're going to lie. You're lying about all this, and it doesn't happen that way or whatever. And so I went silent for 2 years and stopped speaking. And then I had trauma after trauma after trauma. But now that I'm talking more, it's like, that's never going to happen to me again. I'm never going to shut up now. I distanced from my family, divorced them in the week and said, bye-bye, and now I have this new family, and I love everybody here. Yeah, it's breaking that shame cycle has been very difficult, but it's one of the things that I feel, even on my worst days, if I can remember that's broken, then I feel better.
Way to go, AJ. That is such powerful stuff, and you are to be commended, and I'm really proud of you and thankful for you. Thanks for all those comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I wanted to just piggyback on your initial comments opening this meeting, and then Jan's statement. When I learned that shame was, I feel inherently wrong, like there's something wrong with me. I used to say that all the time. There's something so inherently wrong with me, as opposed to guilt being, I did something wrong. Mm-hmm. The guilt part puts you in a place of power. You can fix it. The shame does immobilize you. It makes you feel powerless, because if I'm inherently wrong, how do I change that? As opposed to, if I did something wrong, I can possibly change it, resolve it, fix it. Right? So that guilt part, it's empowering, as opposed to the shame that's debilitating. So when I learned that, believe me, it helped me so much, and it helped free me from, I am a victim, a survivor, a Thrivivor, an overcomer of childhood sexual abuse, but also rape by my father. And no rape is greater than another, right? But when you add on that paternal factor, the shame that comes with that, because if your father can't love you enough to protect you, then there must be something wrong with you. At least that's what the voices used to tell me. And recognizing that and knowing how to call it out. No, that's not you, Michelle. You don't own those thoughts. Those are imposed from society, because society cringes. Jan and I were kind of talking about this earlier. They cringe at the sound, the comments. They cringe at the reality that these things are going on, and they want to shy away from them. And if you're talking to someone and they're cringing, you automatically feel like you need to retreat, because there's something wrong with you. They can't even stand the sight of you. They can't stand to listen to you. It's disgusting. When I learned that was shame and it wasn't guilt, it wasn't anything that I did wrong, there wasn't anything wrong with me, I was empowered to take action for my own life and assign my thoughts a purpose. I started to tell my mind what to think.
I really appreciate you, Dave, and thank you for always being so generous with your time and your many gifts of knowledge and learning with all of us. It's really appreciated.
I appreciate it. I'll speak for myself. I appreciate it, and it was very helpful.
Thank you. I'm glad. It's good to hear.
It was amazing. Again, thank you all for joining. This was amazing and incredible. Have a great evening, everyone.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. I want to again offer a huge thank you to Austen Tanner, Jan Broberg, Michelle Jackson, and the participants of the Thrivivors Community who participated in Monday's online event and helped make this episode informative, educational, and entertaining, and a phenomenal listening experience. And thank you for tuning in. I hope you gained something from this episode and that you'll share it with family, friends, and coworkers. Don't forget to rate this episode and leave a review. Your help in doing this provides growth opportunities for this show. Please also remember that if you are a victim or a survivor of rape or sexual assault, and you feel you're ready to share your story on this show to further your healing or help others on their healing journey, please email me at davemarkel@gmail.com. That's DAVEMARKEL@gmail.com. And we'll talk about the possibility of you being on this show. And finally, please remember to do your part to help bring justice to victims of rape and sexual assault. A great way to do this is to subscribe to this podcast and also to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.